Hi, and welcome everyone to today's LinkedIn Live, where we're going to focus on the EU AI Act and how it'll affect your recruitment work. My name is Tove. I work as marketing lead here at Jobylon, and I'll be moderating the discussion today, which will be a Q&A format. And with me, of course, I'm no expert at this, so I have our biggest expert, Corinne. Corinne, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience today and tell us a little bit about what you do at Jobylon, as well as why you think this is such an important topic to focus on?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Jobylon's general counsel or head of legal, whatever you want to call it. I have many names. So I handle all things legal at Jobylon, but I'm a privacy specialist at heart. And I think this topic is so important because let's face it, AI is everywhere at all companies. And I think one aspect is we need to take a step back and think about what we're doing. But also why I wanted to jump on here today is because I'm really passionate about trying to convert complex topics into something that non-lawyers actually can understand. So that was why I thought we could talk the AI Act today.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point to this. And I mean, before we jump into our questions for today, I just want to highlight why we as a company also want to do this. Of course, a lot of it is for the same reasons as you just mentioned, Corinne. But I mean, we're really eager at Jobylon to jump into this sort of exciting world of AI and recruitment. We have customers who want to do that, who's already doing that. But the thing is, we also want to make sure that we take responsible jumps. So when we're jumping in, how are we doing it? What are we doing about it? Can people trust the things that we're doing and promoting when it comes to AI and recruitment? So when it comes to legislation, that's, a part that's really difficult to keep track of. And as you said, Corinne, it's also very complex. So that's why we wanted to do a short Q&A to kind of clarify what this new act actually is and how it's likely to affect us. And we've prepared the most common questions that we get from customers, but also, of course, if you have any additional comments that you want to add to anything that Corinne answers today, or if you have any additional questions, use the comment section to add those, and we'll get to those towards the end today. Now, let's dive in. And I think, Corinne, I mean, obviously, those who signed up for this, they probably know what the EU AI Act is, but I would love to get a little bit of a sort of short explanation from you. What is it?
Of course. So some of you may have heard of it already, but in essence, it's a law concerning the use of AI systems. It's an EU regulation, which means that it will become directly applicable in all member states as law. So similar to the GDPR. The law defines, for example, what AI systems are in the scope of the act, and from what I've understood from talking to our CTO, the scope of the AI systems covered by the act is quite wide.
Yeah, and we're going to get more into detail on sort of the how this touches upon recruitment and what that is classified as well. But before we get into details, let's take the broader questions first. So when you want to start, like when do you need to start working with this? What's the timeline for the EU AI Act as we know it right now?
Yeah, okay. So the act hasn't officially been approved yet. It is, however, in the final stages, and that is why we've started looking at the text that is now. But we're still waiting for it to be published in the EU official journal. That's like when it becomes approved. And the prognosis for this is by the summer.
Okay. And once this is published, what's the timeline then? Because that's when we really need to start working on things, right?
Yeah, okay. So the thing is, the majority of the act will actually become applicable after 24 months. So we're thinking 2026. There will be some parts, however, that will become applicable already after 6 months. And this concerns what the act states is prohibited AI. And there will also be some longer deadlines, actually, like 36 months for AI systems that are already regulated by EU law, like other EU law, because they fall under the definition of a regulated product. So that could be like medical devices, industrial machinery, toys, cars, etc. Or AI systems that are used as a safety component of a regulated product. But as we all know, it is difficult to reverse the use of something in a especially in a bigger company. And that is why I think it's really good to start looking at the requirements of the Act now and how it could affect you if you're thinking of incorporating AI tools into your recruitment process.
Absolutely. And I mean, apart from just, I mean, you should always care about the regulations of the things that you're doing, right? But why should the AI Act matter to people specifically within companies handling recruitment? What's going to happen if they don't care about this?
Okay, so as I said, the definition of AI systems is wide, and the Act doesn't only concern the development of AI, but actually the use of AI. And I mean, it's also built upon the same model as the GDPR, meaning that you can get fined, and the fines here can actually be bigger, but it will all depend on the infractions, of course.
Okay, so I mean that's a reasonable reason to be aware of this and to actually start preparing for this already, I guess, because you don't want to end up being fined for how you're using AI going forward. Very, very good. Now let's get into sort of a little bit deeper into AI and how this act covers it. But a lot of people are thinking that this kind of legislation is going to limit innovation. And I mean, that comes both from companies developing AI, but also from users who are dependent on AI, who have ideas on how to use AI going forward. But what are some of the more positive outcomes that you see with this type of legislation, and especially this one?
Well, I do understand that people are afraid of this act stifling innovation, but I also think that we have to bear in mind that this act actually aims at safeguarding our fundamental human rights, like including democracy, the rule of law, against harmful effects of using AI. And it is still at least aimed at supporting innovation as well. So, for example, something I see as positive is that the whole regulation is actually built upon a risk-based approach, and that the emphasis is on responsible use of AI. So it's not like you can't use it. It's more depending on the risk level, you need to think about certain things. And I mean, also, if we take the GDPR, before the GDPR came into force, I mean, people were afraid of, again, that it would stifle innovation, but it was also a bit of a wild, wild west out there when it came to companies using personal data. And now we can see in several parts of the world, countries actually adapting to the GDPR, creating own extensive privacy laws, taking inspiration from the GDPR. So those are a couple of the positives, at least that I see.
Definitely. And I mean, that sounds like we might think that it will stifle us, but actually it's probably a good thing to have some sort of railing to hold on to as we move forward with this. So now let's get into actual recruitment. So how will this law actually affect recruitment processes across Europe?
Okay, so the Act, as I said before, is built upon a risk-based approach, which means that different requirements will apply depending on the risk level of the use of AI. So you have prohibited AI, you have high-risk AI, and you have low, medium risk AI. And for all of these, different requirements will apply. And then the Act also introduces a lot of different roles that will have different obligations. So we're going to have providers, deployers, importers, distributors, product manufacturers. I won't go through them all, but I will highlight some. So we have providers that are the companies that are putting the AI systems on the market. So meaning those making it available first on the market or putting it into service. So meaning supplying the AI system for first use. And that doesn't really sound like the company's only using the AI system, right?
No.
But then we have deployers, which are the entities using an AI system under its authority. And here's where I see that TA teams using third-party AI tools could fall in.
Yeah. Okay. So TA teams will most likely be counted as deployers. So they're not developing the AI, but they're using the AI. And I mean, what do TA teams have to think about then concerning like being deployers, concerning their use of AI in recruitment?
And again, I just want to say, like, I don't have the actual explanations of the definitions yet, so you just have to take my interpretation of the definitions. But when we're thinking about deployers, especially in the Act, there's actually an annex called Annex 3 that lists the AI systems that should be considered to be high risk AI. And there we have an article that explicitly states AI systems intended to be used for the recruitment or selection of natural persons meaning living, breathing people, in particular to place targeted job advertisements, to analyze and filter job applications, and to evaluate candidates. And this, at least for me, sounds highly relevant for TA teams looking to utilize AI tools in their recruitment processes.
Definitely. I mean, that sounds like exactly what people are already doing today. So back to what you said, it's a good thing that it actually gets some regulation put on it. But is there something that mentions HR too, or is this only recruitment?
Yeah, okay. So we have a separate point for that as well. And there you have like the section B, which is AI systems intended to be used to make decisions affecting terms of work-related relationships, the promotion or termination of work-related contractual relationships, to allocate tasks based on individual behavior or personal traits or characteristics, or to monitor and evaluate the performance and behaviors of persons in such relationships.
Okay, so HR departments need to be aware of that part as well, in terms of understanding how they can use AI on current employees. That makes a lot of sense. So if we go back to recruitment, I mean, that's what we said we would be talking about today. What do TA teams need to think about? I mean, as you said, this is, not something that's coming into law right now, but it is something that we need to prepare for. So what will TA teams need to think about?
So if we're looking at high-risk systems and deployers and focusing on that, deployers will need to think about having technical and organizational measures to make sure that the system is used in accordance with the instructions that the provider will be, under the Act, obligated to provide, to have human oversight over the system, to monitor the operation of the AI system so that it actually works as intended, and I know when applicable, do a data protection impact assessment. And if the system is used to make decisions or assist in taking decisions about people, so for example, in the recruitment process, you actually have to inform those affected beforehand that this will be happening. So for example, if you're using a chatbot for that purpose, that needs to be clear for the candidate.
Okay, but then it also, I mean, it sounds like something that, these are fairly easy things to incorporate in terms of making sure that your candidate communication is good already today, and that you inform about what the process is, how it's working, what systems are being used. I mean, that's something that people can definitely do already, right?
Yeah,
and then
definitely.
And then to make sure that, as you said, the first point that you mentioned there, that the organizations creating the AI actually have to have instructions as well, to make sure that when you choose a provider, you also get as much information as possible so that you can actually do this. And I think we actually got a question now that I think is really good. Isn't this already covered by GDPR, Article 22? What do you say?
Well, yeah. I mean, you have technical and organizational measures, the data protection impact assessment. There's overlap. We also need to remember that the GDPR is with regard to personal data and privacy, but the Act is so much wider than that. It's concerning like democracy, other fundamental human rights. So it's much bigger. It's not only focused on privacy and personal data. So the GDPR becomes relevant, like in this case, if your input data is personal data, but the AI Act covers more.
That's a really good point. And I love that we got that question, because I think that's one of the parts that might be difficult as well to consider when you talk about AI, is how do these other legislations that we already have in place tie into this, and what's the overlap? Why do I have to care about it? How do I care about it? So I think that's a really good question. Thank you for
It
asking
can also
that.
be good to know that there are actually a couple of instances in the Act where it references the GDPR and
Mm,
like the relationship in between.
very good. Now, pivoting from this a little bit, but there's also, I mean, we talked about that recruitment systems are labeled high risk. And so there's rules regarding that, but there's also one thing you mentioned called prohibited systems. Now, can you talk a little bit about this part as well?
Of course. There are actually a lot of them. So I won't go through them all, but I've picked some that we can talk about. So
Mm,
basically it's AI systems that, as the Act states, deploy subliminal techniques, so purposefully manipulative or deceptive techniques that causes someone to take a decision that that person would not have taken otherwise.
mm,
It's also AI systems that exploit vulnerabilities due to like age, specific social or economic situation in order to distort the behavior of that person. It also includes social scoring that leads to detrimental or unfavorable treatment that is unjustified or unrelated to the context in which the data was collected. It's also AI used to assess or predict likelihood of someone committing a criminal offense based solely on profiling or personality traits. Here we have a little movie reference. I feel like we've seen
yeah,
this in a
definitely.
movie. We also have untargeted scraping of facial images to create or to expand a facial recognition database. But then the one I guess is most relevant for HR teams would be the use of AI systems to infer emotions of someone in the workplace or in education institutions, unless it's for medical or safety reasons, I think.
Okay. I mean, that's yeah, that seems like the only one that would be reasonable for HR and recruitment teams, but it's definitely it's good to also know the distinction between like prohibited parts
Yeah,
and the high risk ones, because high risk sounds like it should be prohibited, because why is it high risk? But actually we have the level of prohibited, which includes all of these. So comparing them to the high risk, it makes sense that there's two very separate pieces, I think.
exactly.
So when we talk about this, I mean, we need to talk about the risks as well. So when it comes to AI, there are a lot of risks that, you know, from the legal perspective, that might not be covered in this act specifically, or that might be something that you need to consider in regards to other areas like the GDPR, like privacy. So what are some of the biggest risks that you see from a legal perspective with AI?
Yeah, so well, we can always start off with my specialist area. So we have privacy. We've already talked about the overlap. But we just need to remember that it's a processing activity when you put personal data into the model, and questions become applicable, such as where does the data go? You need to think about like third country transfers, etc. You always have to have a legal ground for what you're doing. You need to be aware of what the company on the other end is actually doing with the data. For example, will the company use the input data to fine tune the AI or not? And also, if you use AI to make automated decisions as defined under the GDPR. So, for example, the most obvious example is granting or denying a loan. You need to be able to give like meaningful information about the logic behind the decision, so like behind the processing. And that is something that we're seeing can be really tough due to what some people are referring to as the whole black box situation. Because I mean, providers might not want to give out full information and disclosure about their algorithm, as it could be seen as a trade secret. And I mean, it's commercially valuable, of course.
Exactly.
So
And
that's,
I guess
yeah,
automated decisions in terms of recruitment could also be if you make automated hiring decisions, right? Who should move forward, who should we reject, which is prohibited under GDPR as well. But I
I
feel
mean,
like
not
people might circumvent.
it's not prohibited under to make automated decisions under the
Mm,
GDPR. So it's more like you have automated decision making, and the decisions have to be something that creates a legal or similarly significant effect, and that's where you could put in getting or not getting a job, and then you have a couple of requirements. So you have to think about the legal grounds for that, of course, because you can't use any legal ground for that, but then it's more about the information about the logic behind that's important.
Okay. Very good.
But we also have IP, I mean intellectual property. So for example, copyright. The AI might use copyrighted material in its creation of the output. That's one issue, but I know that a couple of the bigger companies, I think, have actually tried to take responsibility for that in relation to the users, but that's something that you need to be aware of. And I think you also need to think about like who owns the output from the AI. If you give it super detailed instructions to create something new, but what is it based on? Who owns it? Is it you? Is the company? It's just questions to be aware of. And then we have discrimination, of course. Like if an AI system completely controls the recruitment process and you're unaware of potential bias, that's also an issue. So I would say that those are maybe the three biggest ones that I can think of right now.
When it comes to the risks, and I think when it comes to discrimination, I mean, obviously, when it comes to recruitment, this is a topic that's being discussed a lot, and rightfully so. Bias and discrimination, it's hard to get rid of bias in a recruitment process, and introducing AI might help, but it might also make it worse. So are there any specific kind of mentions or provisions within the EU AI Act that kind of address discrimination as it relates to AI-powered recruitment tools?
Well, there are a few that do so, or like mention bias in some way or another. For recruitment purposes, it's more in the shape of requirements for providers and deployers in order to like minimize the risk of bias. So, for example, if a deployer has control over the data that goes into the high-risk system, there's a requirement to make sure that the data is relevant and sufficiently representative in relation to the purpose. So thinking if the intended purpose is non-biased recruitment, well, there you go. You have to think about that. But then it's more requirements for providers. So for example, to make sure that the high-risk systems that continuously learn, that they are developed in a way that eliminates or reduces as far as possible the risk of like possibly biased outputs influencing input for future operations. So it's like a feedback loop, and that they actually take mitigating measures to address for such feedback loops. Another one is that training and validation and testing data sets should be examined in view of possible bias, but it's bias that are likely to affect the health and safety of persons, that have a negative impact on fundamental rights, or that leads to discrimination that is prohibited under union law. And then they also need to make sure that there are appropriate measures to detect, prevent, mitigate such possible biases. It actually mentions that personal data may be used in order to combat bias, but it's only when it cannot be effectively fulfilled with processing synthetic or anonymized data. But that one, I think we need to dive a bit deeper into. I just saw it.
It's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out, together with all the personal data laws that exist as well.
And then we have high-risk AI systems that they should be provided so that the users who are in charge with having human oversight of the AI system, that they can remain aware of the possible tendency of automatically or over-relying on, this is very technical terms now, but on the output produced by a high-risk AI system. So they call it automation bias. And it's in particular for high-risk AI used to provide information or recommendations for decisions to be taken by humans.
And I mean, that makes sense. So I mean, when we talk about discrimination, it's good to know that even though we don't know exactly how the EU AI Act will address this, it is already addressing it indirectly when it comes to discrimination through recruitment. So It's good to know. Now, rounding up a little bit, or rounding off this discussion a little bit, but how can you be productive or proactive and prepare yourself when it comes to this type of legislation? So, as we said, the timeline is quite long. Technically, you could put it off, but I'm guessing it's smarter to start working on this now. We already know this is coming.
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's always easier to put new routines in place and to look at systems before you start using them than after you've already like incorporated them into your process. So I would actually just like keep it very simple here. Like make sure the team is actually aware that this regulation will affect recruitment, and also just be aware of the risks of using AI. Top tip is that if you have an internal legal function, if they have not already reached out to you, reach out to them and see if they have anything for you, any guidelines. We have the transparency requirement that we've talked about. That is something to keep in mind, and just to prepare maybe where such information will be given, how. And then also just
to be clear, with transparency, we mean towards the candidates, right? Like
yeah,
what's
exactly.
being used on them, how are decisions being made?
Yeah, exactly. And then also just think about the implications of using AI for making totally automated decisions. Like you have to think about the privacy perspective, the discrimination perspective. There's a lot there. But I would actually say that my biggest tip, at least if you are not developing an AI tool right now, I would say that the biggest tip is, because the biggest bulk of requirements lay with the providers, you can make sure that the supplier of the system is following the requirements correctly to minimize risks. So this includes having like control measures in place to ensure that training data sets are relevant, representative, capable of identifying biases. The software used should be transparent, should have event logs, technical documentation, and also AI processes must always be monitored by humans. But I would also say, bear in mind that as the regulation isn't finally adopted yet, and the timeline in general is 2 years, I wouldn't expect all suppliers to have this in place at this time. I mean, it's a process for everyone to see how we're gonna work with this from now on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And considering that, we don't know exactly, and they haven't finalized this yet, how can recruiters or anybody in the TA space, HR space, how can they stay up to date about what's actually happening in the space and when this is actually going live?
I need to think about what I do myself. Can always follow me. No, just semi-kidding, but I will probably post something once I know something. But I would also say follow the EU institutions on LinkedIn. They're actually quite good at posting once these things happen, and I think the AI Act will get a lot of traction. So so look at there. So I would say actually LinkedIn is a really good space to keep yourself updated on what's happening. Somebody will post.
And then it's often also summarized in a good way so that you don't have to read the full acts or the full kind of news that comes out on it, because it can be quite heavy reading.
Yeah,
exactly. From my view at least, who's not in the legal field. But okay, I'm gonna check if we have any other questions coming in. It doesn't look like it. If you do have any, please feel free to add them. But otherwise, I would say, thank you for joining us today. We have recorded this, so we will also be sending out and sharing the recording afterwards. But if you have any additional comments or questions, feel free to reach out to Corinne after this as well. Make sure to connect with her to follow along on what's happening and more tips and tricks on privacy. And also, of course, we are actually hosting an event with Jobylon on May 16th, which will be both online and in person in Stockholm, on responsible AI, where we won't be focusing only on this sort of portion of it, the legal aspect of it, but we will be covering all types of aspects when it comes to responsible AI, with a load of recruitment and AI experts. So don't miss out on that. I'll share the invite with all of you as well, so that you have it. And yeah, no more questions coming in. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, Corinne, for being here and answering questions with us.
Thank you.
Bye for
Bye.
now.